It is almost dawn, Baghdad, June 28, 2026. Across most of the city, the streets are still nearly empty. But inside the Green Zone, the most heavily protected area in Iraq, a large security force is moving quietly. Armoured vehicles pass through checkpoints, roads are sealed. Heavily armed units advance toward the homes and offices of senior officials and political figures. Some of the targets do not yet know that their names are written on judicial arrest warrants. Others may have received a warning only minutes earlier. And when the doors begin to open by force, the people being targeted are not drug dealers or militia commanders. They are members of parliament, politicians, government officials, and individuals who have spent years operating inside the most protected circles of the Iraqi state. Within hours, reports begin to speak of dozens of arrests in one of the largest anti-corruption operations Iraq has seen in years. But this is not just an arrest campaign. It is a direct confrontation between a new government and a system that has developed over more than 2 decades. A system with money, political influence, institutional protection, and in some cases armed power. The question is no longer simply, who has been arrested? The real question is, can the Iraqi state dismantle a system that operates from inside the state itself? To understand what happened that morning, we have to go back to 2003. After the fall of Saddam Hussein, Iraq began rebuilding its political and economic system. The country held one of the largest oil reserves in the world. Over the following years, hundreds of billions of dollars entered the state treasury. In theory, that money could have rebuilt electricity networks, hospitals, schools, roads, and entire cities. But reality looked very different. The new institutions emerged inside a damaged country. Political parties divided control over ministries. Government jobs became tools of influence, and public contracts, in many cases, became sources of funding for enormous political and business networks. Corruption was not simply an official accepting a bribe in a dark office, it was far more complicated. A company receives a government contract and never completes the project. A project becomes several times more expensive than originally planned. Employees exist only on paper but continue receiving salaries. Shipments are officially recorded and then disappear. Oil leaves the country through complicated networks. Public money moves through companies, banks, and commercial fronts that are difficult to trace. In some cases, the goal is not to steal one payment. The goal is to build an entire system that allows theft to continue for years. Every person inside the network performs a specific role. An employee signs the document, a director approves the contract, a politician provides protection, a businessman moves the money. And when investigators get too close, the system begins to defend itself. Documents disappear, witnesses change their statements, court cases are delayed. And sometimes, a suspect leaves the country only hours before an arrest warrant is issued. This is why Iraqis have heard promises to fight corruption many times before. Almost every government has announced that it would open the biggest files. Committees are formed, names are announced, investigations begin, and then the story slowly disappears from the headlines. Sometimes because the evidence is weak, sometimes because of political intervention, and sometimes because reaching one individual means confronting an entire political party. But in May 2026, a new man entered the Prime Minister's office, Ali al-Zaidi. A businessman who entered politics from outside some of the traditional political structures, and suddenly found himself leading a country trapped inside a complicated regional and economic struggle. From the beginning, al-Zaidi made ambitious promises: protect public money, place all weapons under state authority, and confront corruption networks regardless of their influence. These promises are familiar in Iraqi politics, but only weeks later signs began to appear that the government was preparing for something much larger. According to reports, the investigation did not begin on the night of the raids. The case had been moving for months. Judges and investigators had been collecting documents, testimony, and financial records. One of the most important developments was the arrest of a former official in the oil sector. His interrogation did not lead to a single name. It led to a chain of names and relationships. This is where the picture began to expand. The case was no longer about one administrative violation. Investigators were now looking at a possible network connecting officials, members of parliament, and powerful business figures. But having a list of names is not enough. The more powerful the suspect, the more difficult the arrest becomes. Some figures live in heavily protected areas. Some have armed guards. Others have relationships that allow them to hear about government movements before they happen. This is why surprise was essential. At dawn on June 28th, the operation began. Elite security forces entered the Green Zone and other parts of Baghdad. The Green Zone is not an ordinary neighbourhood. It contains government buildings, parliament, foreign embassies, and the homes of senior officials. Entering it requires passing through multiple security checkpoints. But this time, the forces were not entering to protect politicians. They were entering to arrest some of them. Teams moved toward different targets at the same time. The strategy was simple. Arrest as many people as possible before the phone calls began, before the news spread, and before suspects could escape or destroy evidence. Within a short period, the names of officials and lawmakers began appearing in reports. Some sources said 47 people had been detained during the initial operations, including 12 sitting members of parliament. Later, the government announced that 21 officials had been formally detained as part of corruption investigations, while other suspects remained outside custody. The difference between these numbers matters. During large security operations, some people may be detained for questioning or verification, and later released. This means that not every name reported in the first hours necessarily faced formal charges. But the scale of the operation was clear. This time, the investigation was not limited to low-level employees. The campaign had reached individuals with real influence inside the system. And this is where the danger increased. Because in fragile states, corruption does not exist separately from politics. Money can finance election campaigns. Contracts can preserve political alliances. Government jobs can become rewards for loyal supporters. And when the state begins dismantling a financial network, it is not only taking away money, it is taking away power. After the arrests were reported, parts of the Green Zone were closed. Reports also suggested that several suspects had managed to avoid arrest. This meant that the element of surprise had not worked completely. Perhaps warnings had reached some of the targets, perhaps some had already left, or perhaps the initial intelligence had been incomplete. But the search continued. At the same time, the media war began. Supporters of the government described the campaign as the moment the state began reclaiming its authority. They argued that politicians who had once enjoyed protection were no longer above the law. They said the use of powerful security units was necessary because traditional procedures often gave suspects enough time to escape. But critics asked a different question. Why now? Al-Zaidi was preparing for a visit to Washington. Iraq was facing pressure to reduce dollar smuggling, limit illegal oil networks, weaken the influence of groups connected to Iran, and reorganize its economic and security relationships. To critics, the arrests may have been a political message to foreign powers as much as a legal operation inside Iraq, a message that the new government was capable of taking action, and that it was prepared to confront figures who had previously been considered untouchable. But possible political motives do not automatically mean the corruption cases are false. In Iraq, both things can be true at the same time. There may be real evidence, and the government may still choose the timing of its actions for political advantage. This is where the story becomes more complicated. The campaign could become the beginning of real reform, or it could become a tool used to weaken selected rivals. The difference will not be determined by images of armoured vehicles or by the number of arrests. It will be determined by what happens inside the courts. Will the evidence be made public, Will the suspects receive fair trials? Will the investigation reach the most powerful figures or stop at the middle level? Will stolen money be recovered? And will the cases include all political factions or focus mainly on the government's opponents? Because arrest is not conviction, and every suspect, regardless of their position or the seriousness of the accusations, remains legally innocent until proven guilty in court. Without transparency, the largest anti-corruption campaign could become the largest tool for political revenge. But there is an even bigger obstacle. Even if the courts convict dozens of officials, that alone will not end corruption, because individuals are only part of the problem. The deeper problem is the system that allows the networks to return. Opaque contracts, weak oversight, an economy heavily dependent on the state and oil, political parties that need constant funding, and institutions where political interests overlap with administrative decisions. Arresting a corrupt official may remove one person from the system, but unless the loophole they used is closed, someone else will take their place. This is why the real test for al-Zaydi's government will not be the number of vehicles that entered the green zone, it will be the less dramatic decisions that come afterward. Digitizing government contracts, revealing the true owners of companies, tracking financial transfers, protecting witnesses and whistleblowers, strengthening the Federal Board of Supreme Audit and the Integrity Commission, and preventing political parties from controlling the institutions that are supposed to investigate them. These reforms do not produce dramatic images, there are no doors being broken at dawn, but they will determine whether this campaign changes Iraq or becomes another chapter in an old political struggle. For Iraqis, this issue is not theoretical. Every dinar stolen from an electricity project appears as another hour without power. Every fake hospital contract appears as a machine that was never delivered. Every school that is not built means children studying inside damaged buildings. Corruption does not only take money, it takes time, trust, and opportunity. Since 2003, Iraqis have heard enormous numbers describing stolen and wasted public funds, but large numbers eventually lose their meaning. $1 billion becomes another headline, 10 billion becomes another figure in the news, but behind every number is a life that could have been different. In the days after the raids, al-Zaydi declared that the campaign would not retreat. He said protecting the state required confronting those who had used its institutions for theft. But the most dangerous stage begins after the raids end, when the armoured vehicles leave the streets, when the cameras stop watching the gates of the green zone. That is when the real pressure begins. Political negotiations behind closed doors, attempts to influence investigators, requests to release certain figures, deals offered in exchange for removing names or freezing cases. This is where many previous campaigns failed, not at the moment of arrest, but in the weeks and months that followed. For now, no one knows how this story will end. The June 2026 campaign may become the beginning of the largest dismantling of corruption networks in modern Iraqi history. Or it may end with a small number of convictions while the larger networks survive. It may even turn into a political confrontation that threatens the government itself. But one thing changed that morning. For the first time since the new government took power, Iraqis saw officials and political figures being taken from the area that had long symbolized protection and immunity. It was a powerful message, but messages do not build states. Fair verdicts do. Independent institutions do. Recovering stolen money does. On June 28th, the government was able to reach the doors of the suspects. The question that will determine Iraq's future is, can it reach the system that protected them? Because the hardest part of fighting corruption is not arresting the men who stole from the state. It is preventing the state from creating new men exactly like them.